They say desperation makes you do things you never thought you were capable of. I never believed that until it happened to me. Until I found myself in that office, sitting across from a man old enough to be my father. No, older than my father. A man with power, control, and a twisted smirk that told me he knew exactly what he was doing. And I let him. Not because I wanted to. Not because I had a choice. But because life has a way of backing you into corners you never imagined you'd be in, and when survival is on the line, when everything you love is slipping through your fingers, you start to wonder how much of yourself you're willing to sacrifice to hold on. That's what I was thinking when I walked into his office that day. It was cold inside. The air conditioner was on full blast, but somehow I was still sweating. Maybe it was nerves. Maybe it was the weight of the decision I hadn't even made yet. Or maybe, deep down, I already knew what was about to happen. I could hear the second hand of the clock on the wall ticking away like a slow countdown to something I couldn't escape. Tick, 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 each sound scraping against my skin like a warning I didn't want to hear. And then there was him. Mr. Harris. 68 years old. A man of status. A man with a family. A man who had seen it all, done it all, and probably gotten away with more than I could ever imagine. He sat there, leaning back in his leather chair, his fingers interlocked, his eyes scanning me like he was measuring something. Measuring my desperation. My breaking point. I had rehearsed what I was going to say 100 times before I stepped into that office. I had convinced myself that I could handle it. That I could just sit there, negotiate, and walk out with nothing but a lone approval and my dignity still intact. But the moment I met his eyes, I knew. This wasn't going to be that simple. Not for him. And, if I was being honest with myself, not for me either. Because, in that split second, I saw something in his gaze that made my stomach twist, something dark, something knowing, something that said, I've done this before. And I know exactly how this ends. And God help me, so did I. I could still hear my own voice, shaky but determined, practically begging as I slid the loan papers across his desk. Mr. Harris, please. I really need this approval. I've done everything I can. I've followed every requirement. I've submitted every document. I just need a chance. A chance. That's all I was asking for. And yet, the way he looked at me in that moment made it painfully clear he was willing to give me a chance. But at what price? His office smelled like ink and paper. His chair creaked as he leaned forward. His cologne was strong, too strong, like he had poured it on in layers, covering something underneath. He didn't look at the papers. He didn't even acknowledge them. Instead, he looked at me. His eyes trailed over me like they had every time I'd come in before, like they had during every meeting, every handshake, every polite exchange that felt just a little too personal for a bank transaction. And then, he smiled. It was small, barely noticeable, but it sent a chill down my spine. Because I knew that smile. I had seen it before. It was the kind of smile a man gives when he knows he has the upper hand. And in that moment, he did. Because my hands were shaking. Because my heart was pounding. Because I was drowning in bills, drowning in debt, drowning in the fear that if I walked out of that office without a yes, I would lose everything. Because he knew that I needed this loan more than I needed my pride. And so he leaned in, lowered his voice, and said something I will never forget. Loans like these, his fingers tapped against the desk, slow, deliberate, require a little extra assurance. And just like that, every part of me went cold. I wanted to be wrong. I wanted to believe that I had misunderstood. That I was reading too much into it. But when I looked up, when I saw the way his lips curled, when I noticed the way his hand rested just a little too comfortably on the edge of the desk, I knew. I knew exactly what he was asking for. I knew exactly what he expected. And worst of all, I knew that I was going to let it happen. Because what choice did I have? What would you have done? Would you have walked out and let everything fall apart? Or would you have done what I did? I told myself that I wasn't really doing anything wrong. That it was just a meeting. Just a conversation. Just an exchange. I told myself I could separate it from who I was. That it didn't define me. That it didn't make me a bad person. But deep down, I knew. Once I stepped into that moment, Once I let things unfold the way he wanted them to, there would be no turning back. So before I tell you what happened on that table, before I tell you how it ended, let me start from the beginning. I wish I could tell you that walking into that bank was just another errand on a long list of responsibilities. That I was just another customer. That I didn't already know, deep in my gut, that something about this meeting would change everything. But I knew. Maybe I didn't want to admit it at the time, but I felt it. That slow, sinking feeling in my stomach. That unspoken awareness that I was about to step into something I wouldn't be able to walk away from unchanged. But let me take you back to where this really started. Because the truth is, this story didn't begin in that office. It began long before that, on the nights I lay awake staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of the world pressing down on my chest. On the mornings I forced a smile, pretending I wasn't one step away from losing everything. It began the day I realized no one was coming to save me. For months I had been drowning. Bills piling up like an avalanche I couldn't outrun. Red notices. Overdue warnings. A landlord's voice laced with impatience. I had tried everything, every last desperate attempt to keep things together. Cutting back. Selling what I could. Borrowing from friends who had started dodging my calls. But the numbers didn't lie. No matter how I stretched it, no matter how many nights I lay awake with a calculator and false hope, the math never worked out in my favor. I needed that loan. Not wanted. Needed. Because if I didn't get it, I would lose my home. And what scared me more than anything was that no one seemed to care. Not my husband, not anymore. Not my so-called friends, who nodded with sympathy but changed the subject as soon as they could. Not the bank with its long lines and its cold, scripted responses. But he cared. At least, that's what I thought. If I had still been in love with my husband, would this have happened? Would I have let myself crave attention the way a starving person craves food? I don't know. All I know is that by the time I walked into that bank, my marriage had already been dead for years. At first, I thought it was just routine. That slow fading of passion, the conversations that turned into empty exchanges. Then I realized it wasn't fading. It was already gone. My husband barely looked at me anymore. We lived like strangers under the same roof. We spoke in clipped, necessary sentences. We slept in the same bed, but I might as well have been invisible. I ached for something, anything, to make me feel seen again. To make me feel like I still existed. So when Mr. Harris started noticing me, really noticing me, I didn't know whether to feel disgusted or relieved. Because, for the first time in years, someone looked at me like I mattered. 68 years old. Respected. A pillar of the community. He was the kind of man people trusted. Silver hair, crisp suits, a deep voice that could command a room. The kind of man who made decisions with a single signature, the kind that could change lives. Or ruin them. And he knew it. He carried himself with that quiet arrogance, that subtle smirk of a man who had been playing this game for a long time. And winning. People whispered about him. About the women who left his office with lowered eyes, the loans that got approved under mysterious circumstances. But no one ever said anything out loud. Because Mr. Harris was untouchable. And when he spoke, people listened. I listened. Because I didn't have a choice. The bank wasn't a place of opportunity. It was a place of desperation. People didn't come in with dreams. They came in with pleas. I had been there so many times before, sitting in the same uncomfortable chair, clutching the same paperwork, watching the same board tellers shuffle through my documents like they already knew the answer would be no. And every time it was not enough credit history, not enough collateral, not enough of anything. But Mr. Harris? He was the one who decided whose papers went through and whose got lost in the pile. So when he called me back into his office, personally, I should have known it wasn't about paperwork. I should have known it wasn't about interest rates or repayment plans. Because men like him don't take special interest in women like me without expecting something in return. The moment I stepped inside, I knew something was different. The air felt thick. Not with heat, but with something unspoken. Something that settled into the walls, into the heavy wooden desk, into the way he leaned back in his chair like he had all the time in the world. The sound of the air conditioner hummed in the background, but I still felt warm. Too warm. There were stacks of paper on his desk, but his hands weren't anywhere near them. Instead, his fingers tapped lightly against the polished wood, slow, deliberate. And his eyes. They didn't scan the numbers. They scanned me. Up and down, pausing just enough to make my skin prickle. I felt it then. That familiar tightening in my stomach, that instinctual awareness that I was no longer just a lone applicant. I was something else. Something he had already decided belonged to him. And when he spoke, I knew this wasn't a negotiation. It was a test. One that I wasn't sure I was ready to fail. Or worse, ready to pass. I don't know what I expected when I walked into that room. I don't know if I thought I could talk my way through it, keep it professional, keep it on track. But looking back, I realize now I was never in control. He was. And in that moment, as he leaned forward, as he smiled in that way that wasn't quite friendly, as he made me feel like I was already trapped before he had even said the words, I understood something. I had no idea that this meeting would change my life forever. I should have seen it coming. Looking back, all the signs were there, the way his gaze lingered just a second too long, the way he held my hand a little tighter than necessary when we shook hands, the way his smile always felt just a little too knowing. But when you're drowning, you don't think about the waves pulling you under. You only think about air. And that's what this loan was to me. Air. Without it, I was suffocating, sinking deeper into an abyss I had no way out of. I had been fighting for months. The same tired routine. Standing in long lines at the bank, explaining my situation over and over again to tellers who barely looked up from their screens. I had filled out more paperwork than I could count. I had sat through meetings, made phone calls, tried everything I could think of. Each time, I was met with the same polite yet cold rejection. We're sorry, but your application does not meet our requirements at this time. You'll need a cosigner. Your debt-to-income ratio is too high. Come back when you have better collateral. I wanted to scream. I wanted to shake them, make them see that this wasn't just about numbers on a screen. This was my life. My home. My children. My last chance. But to them, I was just another file in a cabinet. Just another desperate person hoping for a miracle. Then, something changed. I wasn't just another face in the crowd anymore. Because Mr. Harris started noticing me. At first, it was subtle. A slight shift in his tone when he spoke to me. A smile that lingered a little too long. He started asking questions, personal ones. How are things at home? You must be under a lot of stress. A woman like you shouldn't have to carry all this alone. You know, not every woman could handle what you're going through. You're strong. At first, I thought he was just being kind. I wanted to believe that. I needed to believe that. Because the alternative, the idea that his interest in me wasn't just professional, terrified me. But it wasn't until our third meeting, when he called me into his office personally, that I realized exactly what was happening. The first thing I noticed was that he had locked the door. I heard the click behind me, and my pulse jumped. The air in the office was cool, sterile, but my skin felt too warm, my breath too shallow. The second thing I noticed was that he wasn't looking at my paperwork. Not this time. The files were there, sure, stacked neatly on the desk, my name on the top sheet. But his eyes weren't on the numbers. They were on me. Slow, calculating, like he was measuring something. The room felt smaller, the space between us suffocating. I forced a nervous smile, clearing my throat. You said you wanted to discuss my loan approval? His smile widened, and I felt something tighten in my chest. I do, he said, leaning back in his chair, his fingers tapping slowly against the desk. You're a very determined woman. I admire that. I swallowed. My hands clenched in my lap. I just need this to work out. I have nowhere else to turn. There. I said it. I had admitted just how powerless I was. And when I did, his eyes changed. It wasn't sympathy. It wasn't concern. It was something else. Something that made my stomach twist. He leaned forward, his voice dropping lower, as if what he was about to say was some kind of secret. You know, he said, his eyes never leaving mine, not everyone gets opportunities like this. I blinked. Opportunities. You need this loan. Anne, I need someone I can trust. The words hung in the air like smoke, heavy, suffocating. I could feel something in my chest, a cold realization curling itself around my ribs. "What are you saying?" My voice was barely above a whisper. His smile deepened. "I'm saying, in this world, favors go both ways." The room felt too small. The clock on the wall ticked slow, steady, like the sound of my own impending fate. I felt my hands go numb, my breath hitch in my throat. I wanted to stand up, to walk out, to pretend I hadn't heard what he was so clearly implying. But my body wouldn't move, because this was it. This was the moment. The moment where he made it clear that my loan approval wasn't about paperwork anymore. It wasn't about interest rates or financial stability. It was about what I was willing to do for it. And the worst part? He knew I had no other options. And he liked that. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Because what could I say? I could laugh it off, pretend I misunderstood. I could get angry, accuse him outright, but then what? He controlled everything. One word from him, and my loan application would disappear. One refusal, and I'd be right back at square one, drowning. I thought of my bills, of the eviction notice I had hidden in my nightstand. I thought of my children, of the house we were about to lose. And I thought of how easy it would be to just let this happen. To not fight it. To tell myself that it was just one moment. That I could survive one moment. Couldn't I? His voice cut through the thick silence. "You're thinking about it." My breath caught. "I can see it," he continued, his tone smooth, practiced. "I can see the war going on inside you. I know that look." I clenched my jaw. I don't think this is appropriate." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Don't think of it that way. Think of it as an arrangement. A way for both of us to get what we want." He said it so casually, so effortlessly, like this wasn't a crossroads in my life. Like this wasn't the moment I would look back on and wonder if it was the beginning of my downfall. And then he pushed the loan documents toward me. Slow, deliberate, like a contract with the devil. "Take your time," he said, his fingers drumming softly against the desk. "But don't take too long. Opportunities like this don't last forever." I stared at the papers, at the man across from me. And in that moment, I knew I had stepped into something I couldn't walk away from. Because one way or another, after this meeting, nothing would ever be the same again. I sat there, staring at the loan documents, my pulse pounding so loud I could barely hear anything else. His words still echoed in my head. Opportunities like this don't last forever. I felt sick, because I knew exactly what he meant. And the worst part? He knew I understood. I could feel his gaze on me, waiting, watching, enjoying the way I hesitated. Like a fisherman watching his catch struggle on the line. I should have said no. I should have gotten up, walked out, and never looked back. But my body wouldn't move. Because this wasn't just a choice. It was survival. It was the difference between losing everything or keeping my head above water, even if it meant swallowing my pride, my dignity, maybe even a piece of my soul. I cleared my throat, forcing myself to sound stronger than I felt. I just need more time to think about this." His expression didn't change. If anything, he seemed amused. Like he had expected that response. Like he knew that thinking about it would eventually lead to one inevitable answer. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers still tapping against the desk, slow and calculated. "Of course, take all the time you need. But you and I both know time isn't exactly on your side, is it?" I clenched my hands in my lap, my nails digging into my skin. Because he was right. I didn't have time. I had eviction notices, overdue bills, a landlord growing impatient. And if I walked out of that office without securing this loan, I didn't know what would happen next. Or maybe I did. And that's what scared me the most. On the drive home, my mind wouldn't stop racing. Was I imagining it? Had I read too much into his words? Into the way he looked at me, spoke to me? Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe this was just how business worked. Maybe these kinds of unspoken agreements were normal in his world. Maybe I was the naive one. Maybe he really was just being nice. But nice men don't lock their office doors. Nice men don't let their eyes roam over you in a way that makes your skin crawl. Nice men don't sit across from you and make it clear that your future depends on how willing you are to play their game. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles white. Because no matter how much I wanted to rationalize it, no matter how badly I wanted to convince myself that I was misreading the situation, I knew the truth. And the truth was, he was giving me a choice, but it wasn't really a choice at all. Because what kind of choice is it when both options leave you broken? That night, I barely slept. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my husband's back turned to me in the darkness. He hadn't touched me in months. Maybe even longer than that. I tried to remember the last time he held me, kissed me like he meant it. The last time he had even looked at me like I was something more than just another fixture in our home. But I couldn't. And that realization made my chest ache. I thought about Mr. Harris. About the way his eyes lingered. About the power in his voice. About how, for the first time in a long time, someone actually saw me. And that's when the justification started. Maybe this isn't as bad as I think. Maybe I'm making it bigger in my head. It's just one moment. One decision. It doesn't define me. If I say yes, if I let this happen, does that make me a terrible person? Or does it just make me human? Because how many women had been in my position before? How many had stood at this exact crossroad, staring down a decision that felt both impossible and inevitable? And how many had walked away unscathed? None. Because that's the thing about these kinds of choices. No matter what you decide, you lose something. Your dignity. Your pride. Your self-respect. Or your stability. Your security. Your entire goddamn life. And in that moment, lying in bed next to a man who wouldn't even notice if I disappeared, I realized something horrifying. I didn't know which loss would hurt more. The next morning, as I got dressed, I caught my reflection in the mirror. I didn't look like myself. There was something different in my eyes, something dark, something exhausted, something broken. Because I already knew what I was going to do. Maybe I had known from the moment he slid those papers across the desk. From the moment he locked the door behind me. From the moment he smiled in that way that made my stomach twist. I told myself I still had a choice. That I still had time to find another way. But time was running out. And desperation was a cruel, hungry thing. It eats at you, slowly, silently, until one day, you wake up and you don't recognize yourself anymore. And I was already halfway there. So when my phone buzzed and I saw his name flash across the screen, Mr. Harris, my fingers hovered over the answer button for only a moment. Then, with a deep breath and a heart that felt like it might beat itself out of my chest, I picked up. And in that moment, I knew. There was no turning back. I should have let it ring. I should have ignored it, shoved my phone under a pillow, and pretended I never saw his name flash across the screen. But I didn't. Because deep down, I already knew I wasn't walking away from this. Not really. So I answered. Hello? My voice was quieter than I meant it to be, almost like I was afraid someone might hear. There was silence on the other end for a moment. Then, his voice low, smooth, like a whisper in my ear. You've been thinking about our conversation. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. One that sent a shiver down my spine because he was right. I had been thinking about it. I had been thinking about nothing else. I swallowed. I need this loan, Mr. Harris. I know, he said, and I could hear the amusement in his voice. Like he enjoyed this. Like he enjoyed knowing how much power he had over me. Come by my office tomorrow, he continued. We'll finalize the details. I wanted to ask him what that meant. I wanted to pretend I didn't already know. But instead, I whispered a quiet, okay. And just like that, it was done. When I walked into the bank the next day, everything felt different. The air was thicker, heavier, like even the walls knew what was about to happen. I was used to the frustration of waiting in long lines, the impersonal way the tellers barely acknowledged me. But today was different. Today, I wasn't just another customer. I was someone Mr. Harris had personally called in. And that meant something. I could feel the eyes of the bank employees on me, lingering a little too long, curious, suspicious. Did they know? Had they seen this before? Did they recognize the look on my face, the hesitation, the quiet fear, the shame I was already swallowing down? I barely had time to process it before a familiar voice cut through the noise. "Come in, dear." I turned, and there he was, standing at his office door, smiling. The same way he had before. Like he already knew how this would play out. Like he already knew he had won. The moment I stepped inside, he closed the door. And this time, he locked it. The click of the lock was deafening in the silence. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to breathe evenly, to keep my expression neutral. But my pulse was racing, my skin prickling with the knowledge that I was trapped in this room with a man who held my future in his hands. He moved slowly, deliberately, walking back to his desk like we were just two professionals discussing business. Like this was just another meeting. Like this was normal. But it wasn't. And we both knew it. I sat down, my hands gripping my purse in my lap as if it could somehow anchor me. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he just watched me, letting the silence stretch between us, letting me squirm under the weight of it. And then, finally, he reached for the paperwork. Slowly, deliberately, he slid the loan documents toward me, but his fingers, they lingered. Too long, too deliberate. The roughness of his skin brushed against mine, and I flinched. But I didn't pull away. Because I couldn't. Because this was part of it. Because this was what he wanted. "You're a smart woman," he said finally, his voice low, almost soothing. "You know how these things work." I forced a swallow. I just want to finalize the loan." His smile widened. "Of course you do." He leaned back in his chair, stretching like he had all the time in the world. "But loans like these, they need a little extra assurance." The words settled in the air between us, heavy, unspoken. I could have left. I could have picked up my purse, stood up from that chair, and walked out of that office. No one was physically holding me there. The door was locked, but it wasn't chained. It wasn't the room that trapped me. It was the weight of my desperation. And he knew it. He saw it in the way I hesitated. In the way my breath hitched when his fingers skimmed too close. In the way my knees pressed together under the table, not in defiance, but in uncertainty. He saw my war. And he waited. Calm. Patient. Like a man who had played this game too many times to count. He knew how this would end. And deep down, so did I. I let out a breath. Shaky. Weak. It wasn't a yes. But it wasn't a no either. And in his world, silence was an agreement. I felt him move before I saw him. The chair creaked as he stood, a slow and deliberate shift of weight that made my stomach tighten. The air was thick with the scent of leather and old paper, the sterile bite of air conditioning battling the warmth of something more human, more dangerous. He walked around the desk, closing the space between us with steps that felt too controlled, too rehearsed. Like this wasn't the first time. Like he had done this before. And yet, when he reached me, when his hand brushed against the back of my chair, his fingers grazing my shoulder, I felt my body go rigid. Because this was new to me. Because I wasn't ready. Because, no matter how much I had justified it in my head, this was the moment it became real. Too real. Stand up. The words weren't harsh. They weren't aggressive. But they weren't a request either. I stared at the papers on his desk, the ones I had come here for, the ones that held my future, my security, my stability. I could feel his presence behind me, the weight of it, the certainty of it. And somehow, without even meaning to, I did what he said. I stood, not because I wanted to, not because I was ready, but because I was already past the point of turning back. My knees felt weak, my breathing shallow. The room felt too small, the walls pressing in, the soft hum of the air conditioner suddenly deafening. He moved behind me, slow, deliberate. And then, his hands, large, firm, too confident. They rested on my hips, just for a second. Just enough to make my pulse stutter. I should have pulled away. I should have stepped back, told him this was a mistake, walked out. But I didn't. Because somewhere between my fear and my desperation, I had already given in. The wood was cold against my skin. The sharp scent of ink mixed with the faintest trace of his cologne, something musky, something deep, something I knew I would never be able to forget. The room was silent, except for our breathing. And then, the chair creaked again. A shift, a movement. A decision that I wasn't making, but somehow was still happening. My mind screamed no. Louder than anything. Louder than the ticking of the clock on the wall. Louder than the hum of the air conditioning. Louder than the rationalizations I had been feeding myself. But my body stayed still. Frozen. Paralyzed between resistance and surrender. I wasn't in control anymore. Or maybe I had never been in control at all. I hated myself in that moment. Hated the way my breath hitched when his fingers trailed lower. Hated the way my body responded when my mind wanted nothing more than to disappear. Because this wasn't passion. This wasn't romance. This was a transaction. A silent agreement signed with nothing more than a touch, a glance, a decision too painful to name. And the worst part? Somewhere, deep down, in a place I refused to acknowledge. I felt something. Not love. Not desire. Not anything beautiful or poetic. But something raw. Something dark. Something I didn't want to name. Something that made me question who I was. Because I wasn't the type of woman who did this. I wasn't the type of woman who traded herself for survival. Was I? And yet, here I was. Letting it happen. Because I needed that loan. Because I needed to keep my home. Because this was the cost of survival. When it was over, he pulled away first. Not in a rush. Not with any urgency. Like it was just another meeting. Another deal closed. Like this was normal. I felt cold. Not because of the air conditioning. Not because of the room. But because something in me had cracked open. And I wasn't sure I'd ever be able to put it back together. I straightened my clothes with shaky fingers, refusing to meet his eyes. He adjusted his tie. And then, just like that, he reached for the loan documents. He signed them without hesitation, the pen scratching against the paper like a final signature on a deal that should have never been made. "You're all set," he said, his voice calm, steady, unaffected. And that's when I realized for him, this was nothing. For me, it was everything. He slid the papers toward me, the weight of them heavier than I ever could have imagined. I picked them up with trembling hands. I should have felt relief. But I didn't. I didn't feel anything at all. Just numb. And as I walked out of that office, as I stepped back into the real world, back into my life, back into the chaos that had led me here in the first place, I knew something for certain. I had done what I had to do. I had survived. But at what cost? And would I ever be able to live with it? I walked out of his office with the signed papers in my trembling hands. I had what I came for. The loan was approved. The future I had fought for, the stability I had begged for, the thing that had kept me up at night with worry, it was secured now. I should have felt relief. I should have felt victorious. But instead, I felt sick. The bank felt different as I stepped into the main lobby, like it had shifted into something unrecognizable. Or maybe I was the one who had changed. The fluorescent lights were too bright. The hum of quiet conversations, the tapping of fingers on keyboards, the shuffling of papers, it was all normal, routine. But I felt like an imposter among these people. Like they could see it on me. Like the shame was written across my skin. A teller smiled at me as I passed. A meaningless, polite smile. But I flinched anyway. Did she know? Did they all know? Had they seen this happen before? Was I just another woman in a long line of women who had walked into this bank desperate for help and walked out with more than just a loan? My stomach twisted. I needed to leave. I needed air. I forced my legs to move, my heels clicking against the polished floor as I walked as quickly as I could toward the exit. But just before I reached the door, "Take care, dear." His voice. Behind me. Calm. Steady. Unbothered. Like nothing had happened. Like he hadn't just taken a part of me I would never get back. Like I was nothing more than a successful transaction. I didn't turn around. I just kept walking. The drive home felt like a blur. I don't even remember getting into my car. I don't remember turning the key, pulling onto the road, merging into traffic. All I remember is the feeling. The thickness of my own skin. The way my clothes suddenly felt too tight, too suffocating. The way my body felt like it didn't belong to me anymore. I should have been relieved. I had the approval. The money would be deposited soon. My problems were over. But as I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white, I realized they weren't over. They had only just begun. Because the truth was, I had bought my way out of one nightmare by walking straight into another. And this one? It was inside of me now. A sickness I couldn't escape. A deal I couldn't undo. The moment I stepped inside my home, I went straight to the bathroom. I turned on the faucet. The water rushed out in a steady stream, but it wasn't enough. I turned it hotter, then as hot as it would go. I didn't even flinch when it burned my skin. I just grabbed the soap and started scrubbing. Hard. Harder. Like I could wash it away. Like I could erase the feeling of his hands, his breath, the weight of him against me. I scrubbed until my skin was raw, until my arms ached, until my nails dug into my flesh, desperate to scratch something out of me. But it wouldn't come off. It was inside me now. It would always be inside me. And that realization, that cold, suffocating truth, hit me so hard that I collapsed to the floor. Shaking, breathless. Silent tears streaming down my face as I curled in on myself, arms wrapped around my knees like I could hold together the parts of me that had just shattered. Something shifted in me that day. Something distant. Something cold. I didn't mean to shut people out. I didn't mean to let the guilt settle into my bones, to let it fester like a wound that refused to heal. But I did. I withdrew. From my husband. From my children. From my friends. They asked me if I was okay. I said yes. I smiled. I played the part. But I wasn't okay. Because every time my husband touched me, I flinched. Because every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mr. Harris. Because every time I walked past a mirror, I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. It didn't stop at home. It didn't stop anywhere. He was everywhere. At the grocery store, in the reflection of the freezer doors, in the shadow of a man passing by. In my dreams, where his breath was still warm against my neck, where I still felt the weight of him pressing me down. At the bank, where I knew he was watching me. Even when I wasn't in his office, even when I wasn't near him. I felt him. In the way the tellers looked at me. In the way my stomach twisted every time I saw his name on a document. In the way I kept expecting my phone to ring with another call I didn't want to answer. It wasn't over. Not for him. And not for me. Because what happens when you sell a piece of yourself? What happens when you make a deal with the devil? You never walk away clean. You never walk away free. And deep down, in the darkest part of me, I knew this wasn't the last time I'd see him. This wasn't the last time he'd take something from me. And worst of all, this wasn't the last time I'd let him. The weight of what I had done, guilt, is a strange thing. It doesn't hit all at once. It seeps in slowly, silently, like a poison working its way through your bloodstream. At first, I told myself I could live with it. I told myself it was just a decision. A practical, necessary decision. I had gotten what I needed, hadn't I? The money was in my account. The loan was approved. The past due notices were no longer piling up on my kitchen counter. On the outside, my life looked stable again. But inside? Inside, I was unraveling. I stopped looking at myself in the mirror. Not entirely, of course. I still got ready in the mornings. I still did my hair, put on my makeup, made sure I looked normal. But I never really looked, because when I did, I saw her. The woman who had walked into that bank and made a decision she could never take back. I saw the hollowness in her eyes. The quiet shame in the way she pressed her lips together. The sadness that lingered in the way she carried herself, like she had lost something she would never get back. And the worst part? No one else saw it. My husband didn't notice. My friends didn't notice. My children didn't notice. Because I had gotten so good at pretending, at smiling, at making small talk and going through the motions. But when I was alone, when the house was quiet, when the lights were off, when it was just me and my thoughts, that's when the question started. Was it worth it? That question haunted me. I asked myself over and over again, like an echo that wouldn't stop bouncing off the walls of my mind. Was it worth it? Was the money worth the way my stomach twisted every time I saw his name? Was keeping my home worth the way I couldn't stand to be touched anymore? Was my so-called stability worth the way my skin burned whenever I thought about what I had let happen? I told myself it was. I told myself I had no choice. But there was always that small, nagging voice in the back of my mind whispering, Did you? Did you really have no choice? Because maybe, if I had fought harder, if I had searched for another way, if I had held on to my pride instead of letting it slip through my fingers like sand, maybe I wouldn't be carrying this weight now. But that's the thing about regret. It doesn't change the past. It just makes you hate yourself a little more every day. One night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft sounds of my husband's breathing. And I kept thinking, would he do this to another woman? Because if he had done it to me, if he had looked me in the eyes, seen my desperation, measured my weakness, and used it against me, then I couldn't be the first. I thought about all the other women who had sat in that chair before me. Had they all gone through this same thing? Had they walked into his office just like I did, thinking they were there for a financial solution, only to realize they had walked straight into a trap? Had they hesitated the way I did? Had they hated themselves afterward? Or had they gotten used to it? Had they accepted it as part of the deal, part of the world, part of what it meant to be powerless? Would I get used to it? The thought made my stomach turn. I didn't want to believe that I was just one of many. But deep down, I knew I was. I wasn't special. I wasn't unique. I was just another woman in his long history of transactions. And that realization, that soul-crushing, suffocating realization made me feel even smaller than I already did. I couldn't tell anyone. Not my husband. Not my best friend. Not anyone. Because what would I even say? Hey, guess what? I traded my dignity for a bank loan. I let a man twice my age take something from me because I was too scared to walk away. I imagined their faces. The disgust. The judgment. The way they would look at me differently. And so I stayed silent. I carried it alone. I swallowed it down every single day, forcing a smile, pretending everything was fine. Because that's the thing about secrets. They don't just weigh you down. They change you. They burrow into your bones, making a home inside you until you don't even recognize yourself anymore. And I was already starting to forget who I used to be. Who I was before him. Before that office. Before that table. Before I became this version of myself. The version that couldn't take back what she had done. The version that would have to live with this for the rest of her life. And that was the hardest part of all. Have you ever been in a situation where you felt powerless? Where you had to make a choice that you never thought you would? A choice that went against everything you believed about yourself, but at the same time, it felt like the only way out, because that's what this was for me. I didn't wake up one morning and decide to trade a piece of myself for security. I didn't want to do it. But life doesn't care about what we want, does it? It backs us into corners. It puts weight on our shoulders that feels too heavy to bear. And when that weight becomes unbearable, when we feel like we're drowning, sometimes we reach for anything that will keep us afloat, even if it costs us everything. So now I ask you, what would you have done? Would you have walked away? Would you have fought harder? Or would you have done the same thing I did? I don't know if there's a right answer. All I know is that every time I close my eyes, I hear his voice. I feel his presence. And no matter how much I try to convince myself that it's over, that I did what I had to do, I know that some things don't just go away. Some choices stay with us forever. I want to hear from you. Tell me, was I wrong? Was I weak? Or was I just doing what any person would do when they have no other options? And more than that, have you ever been in a situation like this? A moment where you felt like you had no way out? Where someone held power over you and used it to take something you weren't ready to give? If you're comfortable, share your thoughts in the comments. Let's talk about it. Because sometimes the hardest stories to tell are the ones we need to hear the most. If you found this story shocking, if it made you think, if it made you feel something, then make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Shocking Infidelity Saga. There are more stories, more secrets, more confessions that will leave you speechless. Because sometimes the truth is darker than fiction. And trust me, this is only the beginning. Desperation. It's a dangerous thing. It makes us justify anything. It convinces us that crossing a line just once isn't the end of the world. That we can live with it. That we'll move on, forget, heal. But some choices leave scars that never heal. Some choices change you. And the worst part? It happens so quietly. So slowly. You don't realize how much you've lost until you look in the mirror one day and don't recognize the person staring back at you. I should have walked away. I should have fought harder. I should have found another way. But I didn't. And now I live with that. So if you take anything from my story, let it be this. Never put yourself in a situation where someone else has that much power over you. Because once they do, they don't just own that moment. They own a piece of you. And you may never get it back. I got the loan. I kept my home. I survived. But at what cost? Because when I walked out of that office, when I left his world and stepped back into my own, I realized something. I lost a part of myself in the process. And I don't think I'll ever get it back.